My name is Donovan Castellanos. I was a disaster response coordinator who thought I understood catastrophe until Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into an ice age apocalypse. In 11 days, I watched civilization freeze to death while making impossible choices between saving strangers and rescuing my own family. I had to abandon my post, lead survivors through collapsing cities, and learn that sometimes you cannot coordinate your way out of the end of the world. Before we start the video, let us know what country you're tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Donovan Castellanos, and I thought I knew what disaster looked like. For 8 years, I coordinated emergency responses across the western United States. Hurricanes that leveled entire coastal towns, earthquakes that split cities in half, wildfires that consumed everything for hundreds of miles. I was the guy they called when things went from bad to impossible. I had jumped out of planes into burning forests as a smoke jumper, coordinated relief efforts for Category 5 hurricanes, and managed resource distribution after major earthquakes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for watching civilization freeze to death in 11 days. October 15th started like any Tuesday at the Gallatin County Emergency Operations Center in Bozeman, Montana. I had been monitoring increased seismic activity at Yellowstone for 3 weeks straight. The scientists kept calling it normal background fluctuations. But something about the patterns bothered me. The tremors were getting stronger, more frequent, and they were clustered in areas we had never seen activity before. My team and I were actually discussing vacation schedules for November, when the world changed forever. That morning, I remember joking with my team about how we would rather deal with a supervolcano than face another record-breaking wildfire season. Sarah, our communications specialist, was tracking weather patterns while Tom handled resource allocation. We were planning for what we thought would be a quiet end to our disaster season. The irony of that conversation would haunt me for months afterward. At exactly 2:47 in the afternoon Mountain Time, every seismograph within 500 miles registered what would later be classified as a magnitude 8.2 earthquake. But that was not the earthquake itself, that was just the prelude. Then we heard it, a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was not like thunder or an explosion. It was like the earth itself was screaming in pain. Yellowstone had erupted, with a force that scientists later calculated was 2,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. The ash column shot 30 miles into the atmosphere, higher than commercial jets fly. Within the first hour, we were coordinating with emergency services across 5 states, but even then, I do not think any of us understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The eruption created an ash cloud that was visible on satellite imagery within minutes. What looked like a massive storm system on our screens was actually billions of tons of volcanic ash being carried into the atmosphere. The wind patterns were carrying it directly over Montana, the Dakotas, and toward the Great Lakes region. We were tracking something that would affect millions of people, but I still thought in terms of standard disaster response protocols. By 6 in the evening, the ash cloud was moving east toward us at about 60 miles per hour. We were coordinating evacuation procedures and emergency shelter assignments, following the same protocols we had used for major storms and other natural disasters. I was focused on immediate response logistics, completely missing the larger implications of what we were dealing with. The ash started falling in Bozeman around 9 that evening. At first, people were actually excited. Social media was flooded with photos of the volcanic snow. Kids were trying to catch ash flakes on their tongues like it was some kind of natural wonder. But I had encountered volcanic ash during my smoke jumper days in California, and this was different. The particles were finer, denser, and there was so much more of it than anything I had ever seen. What really caught my attention that first night was the temperature. When the eruption happened, it was a pleasant 52 degrees. By midnight, it had dropped to 37 degrees. I told myself it was just the ash blocking some sunlight, creating a temporary cooling effect. After all, I was the disaster expert. If this was something catastrophic, I should know, right? That assumption would prove to be one of the most dangerous mistakes I ever made. The ash continued falling through the night with an intensity that was unlike anything in recorded history. By dawn of day 2, though dawn was barely distinguishable from night now, the temperature had dropped another 8 degrees. The ash was falling so heavily that visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. We had lost contact with emergency services in Wyoming completely, and reports from surrounding counties were getting increasingly desperate. The real problem started when the ash began accumulating on power lines and clogging air filtration systems. The weight was bringing down electrical cables, and the fine particles were getting into generators, car engines, and heating systems. By noon on day 2, we had lost power to about 30% of Bozeman. This was when I should have realized we were dealing with something unprecedented, but I was still thinking in terms of manageable emergency response. That afternoon, we started getting reports of the first casualties. Not from the eruption itself, but from ash inhalation. The particles were so fine they could penetrate most basic face masks. People with respiratory conditions were showing up at hospitals in respiratory distress. The elderly and children were being hit the hardest. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed, and we were running out of respiratory equipment faster than we could redistribute it from other regions. I was coordinating medical supply distribution when I got a call that should have terrified me more than it did. My former colleague at FEMA headquarters in Washington called to tell me they were tracking similar temperature drops across the entire northern United States. Crops were already showing stress signs as far south as Kansas. Livestock in North Dakota were dying not just from ash inhalation, but from sudden temperature shock. The infrastructure failures were cascading faster than we could respond. The ash was clogging everything: mechanical systems, air filters, car engines, generators, even simple ventilation systems. People were trying to clear their driveways and rooftops, but the ash just kept falling. It was like trying to empty a bathtub while the faucet was still running at full blast. Every solution we implemented was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of ash continuing to fall. By the end of day 2, the temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. In 2 days, we had experienced a 23-degree temperature drop, with no sign of it slowing down. I was getting reports from weather stations across the region showing the same pattern everywhere: a steady 10-degree drop every 24 hours. If this pattern continued, we would be looking at sub-zero temperatures within days in the middle of October. That evening, I made the first decision that should have told me how serious this was becoming. I authorized the opening of all emergency shelters in the county, not for a specific weather event, but for an indefinite period. We were transitioning from emergency response to long-term crisis management, though I was not ready to admit that to myself yet. The social breakdown began on day 2 as well. Gas stations were being emptied by panic buyers. Hardware stores were cleared out of batteries, flashlights, and heating supplies. I watched neighbors who had lived peacefully next to each other for decades start arguing over a bag of rock salt. The veneer of civilization is thinner than most people realize, and it only takes a couple days of uncertainty to strip it away completely. Communication systems were starting to fail sporadically. Cell towers were losing power, and the ash was interfering with radio transmissions. We were losing contact with emergency services in surrounding counties one by one. It felt like watching the lights go out across a map, leaving us increasingly isolated. Each lost connection represented thousands of people we could no longer coordinate with or assist. By day 3, we were living in permanent gray twilight. The sun had not been visible for over 24 hours. The ash cloud now covered most of the continental United States, and satellite images showed it was still expanding. We were coordinating by radio with emergency services as far away as Chicago and Denver, all reporting the same conditions, the same temperature drops, the same infrastructure failures. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees. In October. In Montana, we are used to cold, but not like this, not this fast. I was getting reports from weather stations across the region showing the same pattern, a steady 10-degree drop every 24 hours. The mathematics of this progression were terrifying, but I was still focused on immediate response rather than long-term implications. Infrastructure collapse was accelerating beyond our ability to manage it. By day 3, we had lost power to over half the city. The ash was clogging everything: air filters, car engines, generators, even simple mechanical systems. Transportation was becoming nearly impossible as vehicles broke down from ash infiltration and roads became impassable. from accumulation. That was when I started seeing the first signs of serious social breakdown. People were hoarding supplies, forming groups to protect resources, and becoming increasingly suspicious of anyone from outside their immediate community. The normal social contracts that held our society together were dissolving as people realized that official help was not coming, that this was not a temporary emergency that would be resolved by outside intervention. On day 4, I got the call that changed everything for me personally. My sister Maria called from Denver. She was trapped in her apartment with her 2 kids, Emma, who was 8 years old, and Carlos, who was 6. Their water pipes had frozen, solid. The building's heating system had failed, and the temperature in Denver was below zero in October. This was when I realized we were not dealing with a regional disaster affecting Montana and Wyoming. This was happening across thousands of miles. Maria's call made me understand something horrifying. If Denver was experiencing these temperature drops, if infrastructure was failing that far south, then we were looking at something that might be affecting the entire continent. The scope of what we were dealing with was beyond anything in modern history. That night, while coordinating emergency shelter assignments, I finally did the research I should have done on day 1. Volcanic winter. I had heard the term before but never really understood the implications. When massive volcanic eruptions inject enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, they can block solar radiation for months or even years. The last time it happened on this scale was Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused global crop failures and famine. The research painted a picture that was almost impossible to accept. If Yellowstone had injected enough material into the stratosphere, we could be looking at reduced global temperatures for years. Agricultural growing seasons could be disrupted worldwide. Transportation and communication networks could collapse permanently in affected regions. We were not responding to a disaster. We were witnessing the beginning of a new geological age. By day 5, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, a 60-degree drop in less than a week. But it was not just the cold. The ash was creating problems nobody had anticipated. It was getting into water treatment facilities, contaminating food supplies, and making simple travel nearly impossible. Every system our civilization depended on was failing simultaneously. Reports were coming in about agricultural devastation across multiple states. Cattle ranchers in eastern Montana were finding entire herds dead from a combination of ash inhalation and temperature shock. Crop fields that had been green and healthy a week ago were now gray wastelands under feet of ash. The food production capacity of entire regions was being eliminated in a matter of days. The transportation network was collapsing faster than we could adapt. Interstate highways were becoming impassable, not just from ash accumulation, but from abandoned vehicles. People were running out of gas. Their cars were breaking down from ash infiltration, or they were simply abandoning their vehicles when they realized they had nowhere to go that would be any better. This was when I faced the conflict that would define everything that came next. As a professional emergency coordinator, my duty was to stay at my post, coordinate what resources we had left, and try to maintain some semblance of organized response. But as a brother and uncle, I could not stop thinking about Maria and the kids trapped in Denver with no heat and no help coming. I called a meeting with my core team at the end of day 5. Sarah, Tom, and 9 other emergency response professionals who had been working around the clock to coordinate relief efforts. I laid out what I had learned about volcanic winter, showed them the temperature projection models, and explained that this was not going to end in days or weeks. We were looking at potentially years of dramatically reduced temperatures and failed agriculture. The room was silent for a long time after I finished explaining the situation. These were experienced emergency responders who had dealt with major disasters, but nothing in our training had prepared us for the possibility that civilization itself might be ending. Finally, Sarah asked the question that everyone was thinking. What do we do now? That was when I made the decision that still haunts me. I told my team that anyone who wanted to leave, to try to reach family or head for warmer climates, should go now while travel was still marginally possible, because in a few more days I suspected it would not be possible at all. Several of them looked at me like I was giving up, abandoning my post. Maybe I was. But I could not coordinate a response. to the end of the world while my family was dying somewhere I could still reach. 12 people decided to come with me. We spent the rest of day 5 loading 3 emergency vehicles with supplies, medical equipment, emergency food rations, cold weather gear, communication equipment, and enough fuel to hopefully make it to Denver and beyond. Our plan was simple: rescue my family and then continue south toward climates that might still be habitable. As we prepared to leave our posts and head south, I remember looking at the weather projections one more time. If the temperature continued dropping at the current rate, we had maybe 72 hours before travel became impossible for anyone without specialized Arctic equipment. We were racing against the climate itself, and the climate was winning. But we had to try. What kind of person would I be if I did not try? What I did not realize was that we were about to discover just how impossible our situation had become. Leaving the Emergency Operations Center on the morning of day 6 was one of the hardest things I had ever done. We were abandoning our posts, leaving behind the community we had sworn to protect. But staying would have meant watching helplessly as the situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of meaningful response. The temperature was now 18 degrees below zero and falling steadily. As we loaded the last of our supplies into the 3 vehicles, I could see smoke rising from dozens of locations across Bozeman. People were burning whatever they could find to stay warm. Our convoy consisted of 3 vehicles: my emergency response truck loaded with medical supplies and communication equipment, Tom's modified pickup with extra fuel tanks, and Sarah's SUV equipped with our remaining emergency gear, 13 people total, including myself. As we pulled away from the facility where I had spent the last 3 years coordinating disaster responses, I realized I was now abandoning the biggest disaster of my career to try to save people I might already be too late to help. The highways were worse than I had anticipated. Interstate 90 was covered in a layer of ash and ice that made driving treacherous even with 4-wheel drive. The ash had mixed with moisture in the air to create a slick gray coating that was unlike anything I had ever driven on. Visibility was still limited to about 50 feet, and the ash was so thick it was like driving through a gray blizzard that never ended. We had to maintain constant radio contact between vehicles just to avoid losing each other in the murky conditions. About 30 miles south of Bozeman, we encountered our first cluster of abandoned vehicles. A family sedan was stuck in a drift of ash, completely buried except for the roof. A semi-truck had jackknifed across both lanes, its cargo scattered across the highway. Personal belongings, boxes of food and clothing were strewn everywhere, already being covered by the continuing ashfall. We spent 2 hours clearing a path through the wreckage, and that was when I realized this was just the beginning of what we would face. We found them in the sedan, a family of 4 who had been trying to drive south just like us. The parents were unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning. They had been running the engine to stay warm while the exhaust was blocked by ash. The 2 kids, maybe 10 and 12 years old, were barely responsive from cold and oxygen deprivation. We got them into our heated vehicles and administered oxygen from our emergency medical supplies, but the parents were already gone. There was nothing we could do for them. That was the first time I had to make the kind of decision that changes you permanently. We could not take the kids with us. We barely had resources for our own group, and adding 2 traumatized children would strain our supplies beyond the breaking point. But we could not leave them to die either. Tom volunteered to take them back to Bozeman, reducing our convoy to 2 vehicles and 11 people. I watched him drive away with those kids, knowing I might never see any of them again, knowing I was sending him back into a situation that was getting worse by the hour. By evening of day 6, the temperature had reached 25 degrees below zero. Our vehicles were struggling in ways I had never experienced. The diesel was gelling despite cold weather additives, and we had to stop every few hours to clear ash from air filters and radiators. What should have been a 6-hour drive to Denver was turning into an impossible journey. Every mile we traveled was consuming more fuel than we had calculated, and the mechanical stress on our vehicles was enormous. We reached Billings after 12 hours of driving, and what we found there was civilization in freefall. The city was mostly dark, with only scattered lights from buildings with working generators. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, some from people trying to stay warm, Others from fires that had gotten out of control with no functioning fire department to respond. The few people we saw on the streets moved quickly between buildings, bundled in whatever warm clothing they could find. The most disturbing sight was the stream of people walking south along the highway. Hundreds of them, carrying whatever they could manage, fleeing on foot toward some imagined safety in warmer climates. Families with small children, elderly people who had no business being out in these conditions, people who had clearly made the same decision we had but without vehicles or supplies. They were walking into certain death, but they were walking anyway because staying meant certain death as well. We camped that night in what used to be a truck stop outside Billings. The building was abandoned, but the structure provided some wind protection for our vehicles. That was when I faced our first major resource management crisis. We had already used more fuel than planned, due to the difficult driving conditions and constant need to run engines for heat. Our food supplies were adequate, but barely. And most critically, we had people approaching our camp every few hours, desperate for help we could not provide without compromising our own survival. A man approached our camp around midnight, carrying a small child who could not have been more than 3 years old. The child was unconscious from hypothermia, and the man was begging us for medical assistance. Sarah, our communications specialist, who also had basic medical training, worked on the child for over an hour, but we were too late. The man sat holding his dead child until dawn, then walked back out into the ash and cold. I never saw him again. Day 7 began with a moral dilemma that still keeps me awake at night. A woman approached our camp carrying a toddler, maybe 2 years old. She was severely hypothermic. The child was barely responsive, and she begged us to take the baby even if we could not take her. She said she could feel herself dying and just wanted to save her child. She pressed the small body into Sarah's arms and collapsed in the snow. Sarah made the decision for all of us. She took the child into her vehicle, giving the mother what medical attention we could with our limited supplies. When the woman died 2 hours later, Sarah just quietly accepted that we now had a 2-year-old dependent in our group. We buried the mother in the frozen ground beside the highway, marked only by GPS coordinates I recorded in my emergency log. The grave was one of dozens we would see along the route, each one representing someone who had tried to escape and failed. When we reached Interstate 25 heading south toward Denver, we encountered what I can only describe as a graveyard of the modern world. Thousands of vehicles stretched as far as we could see through the ash-darkened air. Cars, trucks, recreational vehicles, motorcycles, an entire exodus of people who had had the same idea we did and found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. It was like looking at the death of American mobility itself. Navigating through the abandoned vehicles was like solving a deadly maze. We had to constantly backtrack, looking for gaps wide enough for our vehicles, pushing smaller cars out of the way when possible. Some vehicles still had people in them, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia, or simply giving up. We stopped checking after the first dozen. There was nothing we could do for them, and stopping to investigate every abandoned vehicle would have consumed time and fuel we could not afford. The abandoned vehicles told stories that were heartbreaking in their familiarity. Families who had packed everything they owned into their cars, only to run out of fuel 50 miles from home. People who had left comfortable suburban houses to die on frozen highways. Children's toys scattered in the ash, photographs blown across the landscape, personal belongings that had meant everything to someone now just debris in the post-apocalyptic wasteland we were driving through. About 50 miles north of Denver, we managed to establish radio contact with my sister Maria. The connection was weak and full of static, but I could hear her voice. She and the kids were alive, holed up in a school gymnasium with about 40 other families. They had heat from a wood-burning furnace and some food supplies, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. She said people were getting sick, supplies were running low, and several people had already died from various complications related to the cold and stress. That was when Maria told me something that changed everything. The roads into Denver were completely impassable. The Colorado National Guard had abandoned their checkpoints 2 days earlier when their own supply lines failed. The city was without power, water, or any organized services. And the temperature in Denver was now 30 degrees below zero, colder than it had ever been in recorded history, even in the middle of winter. The National Guard abandonment was particularly significant because it meant that even military resources, which should have been the most resilient and well-supplied, were being overwhelmed by the crisis. If trained soldiers with military equipment could not maintain operations, what chance did civilian survivors have? The implications were staggering, and I was beginning to understand that we were dealing with something that was beyond the capacity of any existing institution to manage. As we sat in our vehicles, surrounded by the automotive graveyard of Interstate 25, with the temperature dropping toward 35 below zero, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. Continue toward Denver and almost certainly die trying to reach my family, or admit that some people cannot be saved and focus on keeping alive the people I actually could save. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. I made the call to Maria that night, using our emergency radio equipment while we still had battery power. The connection was even worse than before, and I knew it would probably be the last time we could make contact. The atmospheric interference was getting worse, and our power supplies were running low. I told her I loved her, loved the kids, and that I was sorry. She told me she understood, that I had to take care of the people with me, and made me promise that when this was over I would find a way to rebuild something good from what was left. That conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it contained everything that needed to be said between us. Maria had always been the practical one in our family, and she understood the situation better than I wanted to admit. She knew that my attempting to reach Denver would likely result in the deaths of everyone in my group, including myself, without actually saving her or the kids. She was giving me permission to make the rational choice, even though it meant abandoning her. After ending the call, I had to tell the rest of my group what I had decided. We were turning around. After spending 2 days fighting our way south through impossible conditions, losing people along the way and burning through precious resources, we were admitting defeat. Several people in the group argued that we should continue, that we had come too far to give up now. But the mathematics were clear. We did not have enough fuel to reach Denver, and even if we did, we could not get into the city. The decision to turn back was made more difficult by the fact that we were carrying that 2-year-old child Sarah had rescued. The baby needed more calories relative to body weight than the adults, required constant attention that diverted resources from survival activities, and was showing signs of malnutrition despite our best efforts. Every mile we traveled back north was a mile further from any major medical facilities that might still be functioning, though we all knew that such facilities probably no longer existed anyway. As we began the journey back north on day 8, I had to accept a truth that went against everything in my training as an emergency coordinator. This was not a disaster we could manage our way out of. This was not a temporary crisis that would resolve with proper resource allocation and coordination. This was the new reality, and our only choice was to adapt to it or die. The old world of disaster response and emergency coordination had ended along with everything else. The return journey was even more difficult than the trip south had been. More vehicles had been abandoned along the route, creating new obstacles. The temperature continued to drop, now reaching 40 degrees below zero. Our vehicles were operating at the very edge of their mechanical limits, and we were consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate just to keep the engines running and the heaters functioning. Every hour we spent driving was bringing us closer to the point where we would be stranded without transportation. About 20 miles north of our furthest point south, we discovered what would become our salvation. An abandoned farm with a 2-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and most importantly a well that was still functioning, and a wood-burning stove that could heat the main building. The family who had lived there had clearly left in a hurry, probably trying to reach relatives in warmer climates, leaving behind furniture, some food supplies, and enough firewood to last several days. For the first time since leaving Bozeman, I felt like I could use my emergency coordination skills effectively. We established a systematic approach to survival, resource inventory, work assignments, security protocols, and rationing schedules. Sarah took charge of communications, trying to maintain contact with other survivor groups we had encountered. The remaining team members took responsibility for fuel management, food preparation, and maintaining the heating system that was now literally keeping us alive. That evening, as we settled into our first secure shelter since beginning this journey, I realized that we had moved beyond the phase of hoping for rescue or return to normalcy. We were now in the phase of long-term survival planning, and every calculation I was making suggested that the challenges ahead would be even greater than what we had already faced. But for the first time in days, we had shelter, heat, and a momentary sense of security that allowed us to begin planning for whatever came next. That first night in the farmhouse, we lost Jake. He had been with us since Bozeman, one of our most experienced team members and someone I had worked with on multiple disaster responses over the years. He volunteered to check the outbuildings for additional supplies and was gone longer than expected. When we found him 2 hours later, he had collapsed from hypothermia just 50 feet from the main building. The cold was so intense that even short exposures without proper protection were potentially fatal. We had been so focused on getting shelter and heat established that we had underestimated how quickly the extreme cold could kill. Jake's death was a brutal reminder that we were no longer operating in a world where emergency response protocols could protect us. In normal disaster situations, we would have backup teams, communication with outside support, and evacuation options if conditions became too dangerous. Now we had none of those safety nets. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and there was no margin for error. We buried Jake behind the farmhouse next to what had probably been a family garden, now buried under 3 feet of ash. The morning after Jake's death, I conducted a resource assessment that painted a grim picture of our situation. Our food supplies would last maybe 3 weeks with careful rationing among the 10 remaining people in our group. Fuel for the generator would last about 10 days if we ran it only for essential operations like charging our radio equipment and running the water pump. Firewood might last 2 weeks if we burned it conservatively and supplemented it with furniture and other combustible materials from the house. Most critically, we had no sustainable source of any of these resources. The surrounding area was buried under ash, making foraging impossible. The nearest town was 15 miles away through conditions that had already killed Jake in a matter of hours. We were essentially trapped in this location until either the weather improved dramatically, or we found ways to make our resources last much longer than seemed possible. Sarah had taken responsibility for the 2-year-old child we had rescued, but the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The child needed more calories relative to body weight than the adults, required constant attention that diverted resources from survival activities, and was showing signs of malnutrition despite our best efforts. Every calorie we gave to the child was one less for the adults who were doing the physical work necessary to keep everyone alive. It was a calculation that no human being should ever have to make. But survival in this new world required thinking that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. By day 9, we had established systematic scavenging operations to search abandoned vehicles and structures within walking distance of our base. Every expedition was dangerous because the cold could kill in minutes if someone got lost or injured, but we were finding critical supplies: canned food from abandoned cars, blankets and warm clothing, tools that might help us maintain our shelter, medications that could keep us healthy, and most importantly, fuel from abandoned vehicles that could extend our heating capability. The scavenging revealed the scope of the exodus that had taken place. Thousands of people had attempted to flee south, abandoning their homes and most of their possessions to escape the volcanic winter. The abandoned houses in the area told stories of desperate preparation and hasty departure. Closets emptied of warm clothing, pantries cleared of canned goods, family photographs left scattered on floors where people had grabbed what they could carry and left everything else behind. One house we searched had belonged to a family with young children. The kids' bedrooms were exactly as they had been left: toys scattered on the floor, beds unmade, windows now covered with ash. In the kitchen, we found evidence of frantic meal preparation that had been abandoned mid-process. A pot of soup had been left on the stove, now frozen solid. It was like walking through a museum of the moment when normal life ended for millions of people. During one of these scavenging expeditions, we made radio contact with another group of survivors about 15 miles east of our location. A family of 6 who had taken shelter in a rural church that had better heating capabilities than our farmhouse. They had a working wood-burning furnace and access to a larger supply of combustible materials, but they were running critically low on food. This contact raised the possibility of cooperation between survivor groups, but also highlighted the resource competition that was developing. The other survivor group proposed a trade that created a complex decision for our group. They had excess fuel and some medical supplies, including antibiotics, that could be crucial if anyone in our group got sick. They needed food, which we had in slightly better supply than they did. The trade would improve our heating situation and give us access to medical resources, but it would reduce our food supplies when we were already operating on minimal rations. I had to make calculations about resource management that felt like determining who would live and who would die. If we traded away food, could we obtain enough fuel to maintain heating through what was clearly going to be an extended crisis? If we conserved our food, would we have enough fuel to keep warm long enough to find other sources? Every decision required balancing immediate survival needs against long-term sustainability, with no clear right answer. The moral complexity of these decisions was weighing heavily on everyone in our group. These were people who had dedicated their careers to helping others, and now we were having to make choices about resource allocation that directly affected other people's survival. The psychological toll was becoming as dangerous as the physical challenges we faced. Everyone was dealing with guilt about the people we could not save, uncertainty about whether our own choices were correct, and the daily stress of survival in impossible conditions. We had lost 3 people from our original group of 13. Tom had returned to Bozeman with the children we rescued, Jake had died from hypothermia, and now we were struggling to keep 10 people alive with resources that might not be adequate for even half that number. The mathematics of survival were brutal, and every day brought new evidence that most of us were not going to make it through this crisis. The psychological impact was manifesting in different ways among the group members. Some people were becoming increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring out the ash-covered windows or lying silently in their sleeping areas. Others were becoming hyperactive, obsessively checking and rechecking our supplies, maintaining equipment that was already in good condition, or proposing elaborate plans for finding additional resources that everyone knew were unrealistic. Sarah was spending more and more of her time caring for the 2-year-old child, which meant less time on communication duties and other survival activities. The child was not adapting well to the rationed diet, was losing weight visibly, and was becoming increasingly lethargic. We were facing the horrible possibility that we might have to make an impossible choice about resource allocation, a choice that would define us as human beings regardless of what we decided. That night, while monitoring emergency radio broadcasts on our battery-powered equipment, I heard something that put our situation in devastating perspective. A National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Weather Service broadcast, one of the few government communications still functioning, reported that global temperatures had dropped an average of 8 degrees Celsius since the eruption. Agricultural regions worldwide were experiencing complete crop failures. The broadcast estimated that normal growing seasons might not resume for 2 to 5 years. The implications of this information were staggering. If global agriculture had essentially stopped, and if transportation networks had collapsed across much of the northern hemisphere, then the food currently available was essentially all the food there was going to be until growing seasons resumed. With global food production at near zero, and with billions of people competing for stored supplies, our little group of survivors was facing the same crisis as everyone else on Earth. I spent most of that night doing calculations that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks earlier. If normal agriculture was suspended for 2 to 5 years, and if current food stores were all that existed, then the carrying capacity of the planet had suddenly dropped to a fraction of its current population. Most of the people currently alive were going to die, not from the cold or the ash, but from starvation over the coming months and years. This realization forced me to confront the true scope of what we were dealing with. We were not just trying to survive a temporary disaster until help arrived, or conditions improved. We were trying to survive the collapse of global civilization and the die-off of most of the human population. The skills and resources that might keep us alive were not those of disaster response and emergency management, but those of primitive Survival in a world that no longer had the infrastructure to support large populations. By the end of day 9, I was planning for scenarios I had never imagined having to consider. What would we do when our food ran out completely? How could we maintain heating fuel through potentially years of volcanic winter? Could we establish some form of sustainable food production in a climate that was now colder than the Arctic? And most difficult of all, what ethical frameworks could guide our decisions when every choice meant determining who lived and who died? The weight of leadership in these circumstances was becoming unbearable. Every decision I made affected not just my own survival, but the survival of 9 other people who were depending on me to somehow navigate the impossible. I was a disaster coordinator, trained to manage emergencies and coordinate relief efforts, with outside support. But this was not an emergency. This was the new permanent reality, and none of my training had prepared me for leading people through the end of the world. The child that Sarah had been caring for was deteriorating rapidly despite our best efforts. The little one was not getting adequate nutrition from our rationed supplies, was losing body heat faster than we could maintain it, and was showing signs of the kind of malnutrition that could cause permanent developmental damage, even if we somehow managed to keep the child alive. Sarah was becoming increasingly desperate in her care efforts, spending more of our fuel to keep the child warm, using more of our medical supplies, and consuming more of her own food ration to try to increase milk production for the baby. We were facing decisions that were testing the limits of human morality. Do we continue to support a child who might not survive regardless of our efforts, when those resources could mean the difference between life and death for multiple adults? Do we risk the survival of people who have a better chance of making it through this crisis to try to save someone who might die anyway? These were calculations that felt inhuman to make, but survival in this new world required thinking that prioritized group survival over individual compassion. The isolation was also becoming a critical factor in our psychological state. We had not had meaningful contact with the outside world for days. Our radio equipment was running low on power, and atmospheric interference was making communication increasingly difficult. We did not know if there were still functioning government agencies anywhere, if other survivor groups were succeeding in their efforts, or if there was any organized response to the global crisis taking place around us. The farmhouse itself was becoming a prison as much as a shelter. We could not venture outside for more than a few minutes without risking death from exposure. The windows were completely covered with ash, blocking any natural light that might have penetrated the perpetual gray twilight outside. We were living by the light of battery-powered lanterns and the glow from the wood-burning stove, rationing even our artificial light to preserve battery power for essential operations. Food preparation had become a complex logistical challenge. We were stretching our supplies by making thin soups from canned goods, supplemented with whatever edible materials we could find in the abandoned farmhouse. Every meal was carefully portioned to ensure that each person received exactly their calculated share of calories, with no exceptions and no second helpings. The constant hunger was affecting everyone's mood, energy levels, and ability to think clearly. Water was another growing concern. The well was still functioning, but we had to run the electric pump periodically using our generator, which consumed precious fuel. We were collecting snow and ash mixture to melt for additional water, but the ash contamination made it barely drinkable even after filtering. We were also concerned about the long-term effects of consuming ash-contaminated water, but we had no choice given our limited supplies. The heating system required constant attention and fuel management that was consuming hours of each day. We had to maintain the wood-burning stove around the clock to prevent the interior temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. This meant that someone had to be awake and tending the fire at all times, which was exhausting our group members and preventing anyone from getting adequate rest. The psychological pressure of these conditions was manifesting in ways that threatened group cohesion. People were becoming irritable over minor issues, arguments were breaking out over resource allocation decisions, and there was growing tension between those who wanted to take more risks to find additional supplies and those who preferred to conserve what we had. I was spending increasing amounts of time mediating disputes and trying to maintain group morale. Sleep had become difficult for everyone. The constant cold, the unfamiliar environment, the stress of survival, and the knowledge that our situation was probably hopeless were keeping people awake at night. The lack of adequate rest was affecting judgment, physical performance, and emotional stability. People were making mistakes that could have been dangerous, forgetting important safety protocols, and showing signs of exhaustion that were compromising our collective survival efforts. The reality of our situation was becoming undeniable. We were not waiting for rescue or for conditions to improve so we could return to normal life. We were trying to survive the end of civilization with inadequate resources in conditions that were designed to kill human beings. Every day we remained alive was borrowed time, and every decision we made was potentially the difference between surviving another day or dying in the next few hours. As day 9 ended and we prepared for what we all understood would be an even more challenging day 10, I realized that we had moved beyond the phase of hoping for rescue or return to normalcy. We were now in the phase of long-term survival planning, and every calculation I was making suggested that most of us were not going to make it. But some of us might, and it was my responsibility to make the decisions that would give some of us the best chance possible, even if it meant making choices that would haunt me for whatever remained of my life. Day 10 was when I finally stopped thinking like an emergency coordinator responding to a temporary disaster and started thinking like a survivor in a permanent new world. The temperature had stabilized at 42 degrees below zero. The sun was barely a dim glow through the ash-laden atmosphere, providing almost no meaningful heat, and the radio broadcasts had stopped entirely. We were now completely cut off from any organized authority or information source. That morning I had to make the choice that still haunts my dreams. The 2-year-old we had rescued was dying despite everything we could do. The child was consuming resources we could not spare and requiring constant care that was preventing Sarah from contributing to our survival efforts. I called a group meeting to discuss options no human being should ever have to consider. The discussion nearly tore our group apart. 3 people argued we had a moral obligation to care for the child regardless of the cost. 2 others argued that saving 8 lives by sacrificing 1 was the only rational choice. Sarah refused to abandon the child and said she would leave the group if necessary to continue caring for the baby. The remaining person, Mike, who had been Tom's partner in our original emergency response team, just stared at the floor and said he could not be part of whatever decision we made. The tension in that room was unlike anything I had experienced in my years of emergency coordination. These were good people, trained professionals who had dedicated their careers to saving lives, and we were discussing whether to let a child die to improve our own survival odds. The conversation went in circles for hours, with voices getting louder and positions becoming more entrenched, until I realized that we were destroying ourselves with a debate that might not even matter. In the end, nature made the decision for us. The child died peacefully during the night between day 10 and day 11, probably from a combination of malnutrition and exposure. We buried the small body in the frozen ground behind the farmhouse, and none of us talked about it afterward. But something had changed in our group dynamic. We had all faced the reality of what survival in this new world actually meant, and we could never go back to the moral certainties we had held before. Day 11 was when we finally achieved something like operational stability. We had established sustainable routines for fuel conservation, food rationing, security, and maintenance of our heating system. Our resource calculations suggested we could survive for approximately 6 to 8 weeks with careful management, which would buy us time to either find additional resources or establish more sustainable systems. We made contact again with the survivor group at the rural church. They had taken in 2 more families but were now critically short on food. They proposed a merger, combining our groups to share resources and labor. After careful calculation, I determined that the combined group would actually have better survival odds than either group separately, despite the increased number of people. The mathematics were complex but compelling. The church group had superior heating capabilities and more space, while we had better food supplies and medical equipment. Combined, we would have 15 people, but the improved heating efficiency and shared labor would more than compensate for the additional mouths to feed. Most importantly, the larger group would provide redundancy in critical skills and the ability to undertake more ambitious scavenging operations. The integration process was more complex than I had anticipated. The church group had established different survival protocols, different leadership, structures, and different approaches to resource management. As the most experienced emergency coordinator, I became the de facto leader of the combined group, but had to navigate existing relationships and hierarchies that I did not fully understand. The church group was led by a man named Pastor Williams, who had been organizing the survival efforts for his community since the eruption began. He was not formally trained in emergency management, but he had natural leadership abilities and the trust of his people. Integrating our two groups meant finding ways to combine his moral authority with my technical expertise, without undermining either leadership structure. We chose the church as our primary base because it had better heating capabilities and more space, but maintained the farmhouse as a secondary location for resource storage and emergency backup. The church building had a large wood-burning furnace that could heat the entire structure more efficiently than our smaller stove, and the main sanctuary provided space for the entire group to gather for meetings and communal activities. Moving our supplies and people from the farmhouse to the church was a logistical challenge that required multiple trips through the deadly cold. We had to carefully plan each expedition to minimize exposure time, while maximizing the amount of materials we could transport. Every trip risked someone getting lost in the ash-covered landscape or succumbing to hypothermia during the journey. For the first time since the eruption, I felt like we were building something sustainable rather than just postponing inevitable death. The combined group had a surprisingly useful mix of skills. 2 farmers who understood food production, a mechanic who could maintain our essential equipment, a nurse who could handle medical emergencies, a teacher who could help maintain group morale and education, someone with electrical experience who could manage our power systems, and several people with general construction and maintenance abilities. Through conversations with the new group members, I began to understand the larger scope of what had happened across the region. They had had contact with other survivor groups before joining us. Rural communities were generally faring better than urban areas. People with wood-burning heating and well water were surviving, while people dependent on electrical grids and municipal services were mostly dead. The new world was going to be a much smaller, much more rural place. The rural advantage was becoming clear in multiple ways. Rural areas had more space between structures, reducing competition for resources. Rural people were more likely to have practical skills like farming, hunting, and equipment maintenance. Rural infrastructure was often simpler and more robust, with wood heating, well water, and local food production that could function independently of larger systems. Urban areas, by contrast, were experiencing complete collapse. The high population density meant that resources were quickly exhausted. Urban infrastructure was completely dependent on external inputs like electricity, fuel, and food transportation that were no longer functioning. Urban populations had fewer practical survival skills and less access to basic necessities like heat sources and water. I called the first planning meeting for our new community on day 11. We needed to think beyond immediate survival toward spring and beyond. Could we establish some form of agriculture in the new climate? Could we maintain heating fuel through a winter that might last years? Could we develop skills and systems that would allow us to rebuild some form of civilization from what remained? Our combined group had encountered several other survivor communities within a 20-mile radius during their various scavenging operations. Some were individual families trying to survive in isolated farmhouses. Others were larger groups like ours that had formed around churches, schools, or other community centers. The larger groups seemed to be faring better, but there was also evidence of conflict between communities over resources. We organized systematic exploration of the surrounding area, mapping abandoned properties, cataloging available resources, and identifying other survivor groups. Within our 20-mile operational radius, we identified at least 6 other survival communities, ranging from individual families to groups of up to 30 people. Some were willing to trade and cooperate, while others were hostile and territorial. The hostile groups were a growing concern. As resources became scarcer and the reality of long-term survival set in, some communities were becoming increasingly aggressive about protecting their supplies and territory. We had heard reports of armed conflicts between survivor groups, with some communities attempting to raid others for food, fuel, and equipment. What emerged from our expanded community was a primitive, but functional social structure. Our group became largely self-governing with decisions made through group discussion and consensus when possible. I maintained overall coordination responsibilities, but specific areas like food production, security, and resource management were handled by people with relevant expertise. It was not democracy as we had known it, but it was organized and functional. The social structure was necessarily more authoritarian than what we had been accustomed to in normal times. Individual preferences and rights had to be subordinated to group survival requirements. Work assignments were based on necessity rather than personal choice. Resource allocation was determined by collective needs rather than individual desires. Privacy and personal space were luxuries we could not afford. By the end of day 11, we were planning for what we understood would be at least a year of survival in the new climate, possibly much longer. We had identified seed stocks that might be adapted to the colder conditions, though we would need to create some form of protected growing environment. We had located equipment that could be modified for the changed environment, and we had established contact with enough other communities to create a basic trade network for essential resources. The agricultural planning was particularly challenging. Normal growing seasons would not resume for years, if ever. We needed to develop methods for food production that could function in a climate that was now colder than most places on Earth had ever experienced. This meant greenhouse construction, soil heating systems, and crop selection based on extreme cold tolerance rather than traditional agricultural considerations. We had found some greenhouses on abandoned properties that could potentially be modified for food production, but they would require significant heating inputs to maintain growing temperatures. We were exploring the possibility of using waste heat from our heating systems to warm growing areas, but this would require careful engineering to avoid compromising our primary heating needs. The psychological adaptation was ongoing and difficult. Everyone in our community had lost family members, friends, and the entire world they had known. But humans are remarkably adaptable, and people were beginning to form new relationships, establish new routines, and find meaning in the work of building our small community. The shared struggle was creating bonds between people who had been strangers just weeks earlier. Children were adapting to the new reality faster than adults. The few children in our expanded group seemed to accept the changed circumstances as normal, while adults continued to grieve for the world that had been lost. This generational difference was both heartening and disturbing, suggesting that the new world would be shaped primarily by those who had never known the old one. We established regular community meetings where people could voice concerns, propose solutions to problems, and maintain social connections that were critical for group cohesion. These meetings served multiple functions, from practical planning to psychological support to conflict resolution. They were becoming the foundation of our primitive democratic governance structure. The trade relationships with other communities were developing into a basic economic system. We were trading excess medical supplies for food, providing emergency coordination expertise in exchange for mechanical services, and participating in a regional information network that helped all communities track resources and threats. This inter-community cooperation was suggesting that larger-scale organization might be possible, even in the post-collapse world. Security was becoming an increasing concern as we established more contacts with other groups. Not all communities were interested in peaceful cooperation. Some were organized around taking resources from others rather than producing or finding their own. We had to establish security protocols, assign guard duties, and develop defensive plans for our facilities. The security planning was complicated by the fact that most of our group members were not trained for combat or violence. We were emergency responders, medical personnel, and community workers, not soldiers or police officers. We had to learn defensive skills while hoping we would never need to use them. But the reports from other communities suggested that conflict was becoming increasingly common as resources became scarcer. By the middle of day 11, we had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. We had established a functioning community of 15 people with sustainable resource management, organized decision-making, productive work assignments, and defensive capabilities. We were not just surviving anymore. We were building the foundation for whatever civilization might emerge from the global catastrophe. The long-term planning was necessarily speculative, but we were beginning to envision what our community might look like in months or years. We were planning for permanent settlement rather than temporary survival. We were thinking about skills, preservation, education for the children, and the possibility of growth through integration with other communities or recruitment of individual survivors. The skills preservation was particularly important. Our community included people with knowledge of modern technology, agricultural techniques, medical procedures, and organizational systems that might be lost if not actively maintained and transmitted. We were beginning to organize informal education programs to ensure that critical knowledge would survive even if individual people did not. As day 11 ended, I realized that we had accomplished something remarkable. We had survived the immediate crisis of the eruption and the first phase of the volcanic winter. We had established a stable community with sustainable resource management and effective governance. We had created the foundation for long-term survival and potentially for rebuilding some form of civilization from the remnants of the old world. But we were also facing the reality that our situation, while stable, was still precarious. Our resource calculations suggested we could survive for weeks or months, but not indefinitely without additional inputs. The climate showed no signs of improving and might continue to deteriorate. Other communities were becoming increasingly competitive and potentially hostile as the full scope of the crisis became apparent to everyone. The next phase of our survival would require not just maintaining what we had built, but expanding and strengthening it to ensure long-term viability. We needed to increase our resource base, strengthen our defensive capabilities, and develop more sophisticated agricultural and technological systems. Most importantly, we needed to continue building relationships with other communities that could provide mutual support and shared resources. As I prepared for sleep on day 11, I felt something I had not experienced since the eruption began: hope. Not hope for return to the old world, which was clearly impossible, but hope for building something new and sustainable from what remained. We had proven that organized communities could survive in the new world. Now we had to prove that they could thrive and grow, providing the foundation for whatever human civilization would emerge from this global catastrophe. I am recording this message 3 months after the eruption, as spring should be arriving but will not. The temperature has stabilized at about 40 degrees below zero. We have made contact with survivor communities across several states, establishing a primitive but functional communication network. Our community has grown to 23 people, and we have successfully begun some small-scale food production using improvised greenhouse techniques. What I have learned is that disaster coordination skills are useful, but survival requires a completely different mindset. You cannot coordinate your way out of the end of the world, but you can use organizational skills to help people adapt to a new world. Leadership in survival situations means making impossible choices and living with the consequences. And sometimes, keeping people alive is more important than keeping them comfortable or maintaining the moral standards of the world that no longer exists. The integration of our original farmhouse group with Pastor Williams and his church community created the foundation for everything that followed. By combining our emergency response expertise with their community organization and moral leadership, we established a survival model that proved sustainable when many other groups failed. The church building became not just our shelter, but the center of a new kind of civilization that was emerging from the ruins of the old world. Our first major expansion came when we encountered a family of 4 who had been surviving in an abandoned school building about 10 miles from our location. They had a 12-year-old daughter who had been keeping detailed records of weather patterns, temperature changes, and resource availability in their area. Her data proved invaluable for our long-term planning, and her scientific approach to survival impressed everyone in our community. The family brought more than just additional people to our group. The father had been a mechanical engineer before the eruption, and he had spent weeks modifying equipment to function in the extreme cold. He had developed techniques for insulating pipes, improving heating, efficiency, and maintaining mechanical equipment in conditions that would normally destroy most machinery. His innovations allowed us to expand our operational capabilities significantly. The mother was a former teacher who immediately began organizing educational activities for the few children in our expanded community. She understood that maintaining educational standards and preserving knowledge was critical for long-term community development. Her work with the children also provided psychological benefits for the adults, giving everyone hope that there would be a future worth preparing for. The 12-year-old daughter, Emma, had been maintaining detailed weather records since the eruption began. Her data showed patterns in temperature fluctuation, ash settlement, and atmospheric conditions that we had not detected with our less systematic observations. This information allowed us to make better predictions about resource needs, agricultural planning, and long-term climate expectations. By day 20 after the eruption, we had established contact with 7 other survivor communities within a 50-mile radius. Some were thriving like ours with organized leadership and sustainable resource management. Others were struggling with internal conflicts, resource shortages, or security threats from hostile groups. We began developing a regional communication network that allowed communities to share information about resources, threats, and opportunities for cooperation. The communication network revealed the larger pattern of survival and failure across our region. Communities that had established strong leadership early, focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term comfort, and maintained cooperation among members were generally succeeding. Communities that had descended into infighting, failed to establish resource management systems, or become isolated from other groups were failing at alarming rates. One community we contacted had started with over 40 people, but had split into 3 hostile factions that were competing for the same limited resources. Another had maintained unity, but had failed to establish sustainable food production, resulting in gradual starvation that was reducing their numbers week by week. A third had become so paranoid about security threats that they had isolated themselves, completely cutting off trade relationships that could have provided essential resources. We organized our first inter-community meeting in early November, bringing together representatives from 5 survivor communities to discuss mutual aid agreements, resource sharing, and collective security. The meeting took place at our church, which had become recognized as a central hub for regional coordination due to our communication equipment and organizational capabilities. The mutual aid agreements established protocols for sharing resources during emergencies, coordinating responses to security threats, and facilitating trade between communities with different resource strengths. Our community specialized in medical, care, and emergency coordination, while other communities focused on food production, mechanical services, or security operations. This specialization allowed each community to develop expertise while maintaining access to services they could not provide internally. The trade relationships were more complex than simple resource exchange. We were developing currency systems based on labor hours, resource values, and service provision. Communities were establishing credit relationships, allowing for delayed payment arrangements that helped manage seasonal resource variations. We were also developing quality standards and dispute resolution mechanisms that allowed trade to function reliably over time. The security situation was becoming increasingly important as we established more contacts with other groups. Not all communities were interested in peaceful cooperation. Some had adopted raiding strategies, attempting to take resources from more successful communities rather than developing sustainable production systems. We had to establish defensive protocols and coordinate security responses with allied communities. Our first serious security challenge came in late November, when a group of approximately 20 armed individuals attempted to raid our food storage facilities. They had apparently been monitoring our community for weeks, identifying our resource stores and planning their attack. The raid was unsuccessful because our security protocols and inter-community cooperation allowed us to mount an effective defense, but it demonstrated the growing importance of organized security arrangements. The raiders were not random bandits, but an organized group from a failed community about 30 miles away. Their own resource management had collapsed, and rather than attempting to rebuild or join another community, they had decided to survive by taking from others. This pattern was becoming common as the reality of long-term survival became apparent to communities that had not established sustainable systems. The defense of our community required careful coordination between our internal security team and allied communities that provided backup support. We had established communication protocols that allowed rapid response to security threats, shared intelligence about hostile groups, and coordinated patrols of the areas between allied communities. This regional security cooperation was becoming as important as resource sharing for long-term survival. The agricultural experiments we began in October were showing promising results by December. Using salvaged greenhouse materials and waste heat from our heating systems, we had established small-scale growing operations that were producing fresh vegetables even in the extreme cold. The food production was minimal compared to our overall needs, but it provided essential vitamins and demonstrated that sustainable agriculture was possible in the new climate. The greenhouse operations required constant attention and significant energy inputs, but they represented hope for long-term food security. We were growing cold-tolerant vegetables like kale, spinach, and root vegetables that could survive in conditions that would have been impossible for traditional crops. The success of these experiments encouraged other communities to begin similar projects, creating a regional knowledge base for post-eruption agriculture. The agricultural development was more challenging than we had initially anticipated. Soil had to be imported from areas less contaminated by ash, seeds had to be carefully selected for cold tolerance, and growing conditions had to be maintained artificially through heating systems that consumed significant fuel. Every plant that survived to harvest represented hours of labor and considerable resource investment, but the psychological benefits of producing fresh food were enormous. December. Our community had evolved into something that resembled a small town more than a survival group. We had established specialized work roles, organized decision-making processes, educational systems for the children, and cultural activities that helped maintain morale and social cohesion. People were forming relationships, planning for the future, and beginning to think of our community as a permanent home rather than a temporary refuge. The work specialization had developed naturally based on individual skills and community needs. We had full-time roles for medical care, education, security, agriculture, mechanical maintenance, communication, and resource management. People were developing expertise in their assigned areas, while also maintaining basic survival skills that everyone needed. This specialization increased efficiency, while maintaining the flexibility needed for emergency situations. The decision-making processes had evolved from my initial emergency coordination authority into a more democratic system that included input from all community members. We held weekly community meetings where major decisions were discussed and voted on, daily leadership meetings for routine operational issues, and specialized committees that handled specific areas like security, agriculture, and education. The psychological transformation was as important as the practical survival achievements. People were adapting to the new reality, forming new identities based on their roles in the community, and developing hope for the future based on what we were building together. The initial trauma and grief were being replaced by purpose and belonging, though the underlying loss of the previous world remained a constant presence in everyone's experience. The children in our community were adapting most quickly to the new circumstances. They were learning practical skills, accepting the changed environment as normal, and forming friendships that were not burdened by memories of the previous world. Watching the children adapt gave the adults hope that human civilization could continue and thrive, even under dramatically changed conditions. The educational system we had developed was necessarily different from traditional schooling. Children were learning basic academic subjects like reading, writing, and mathematics, but also practical skills like equipment maintenance, food production, and resource management. The goal was to prepare them for adult roles in our community, while preserving the knowledge and cultural values that we wanted to maintain from the previous world. We estimate it will be at least 2 years before growing seasons return to anything approaching normal, possibly much longer. Our community is planning for the long term, establishing sustainable systems, preserving knowledge and skills, and building the foundation for whatever civilization might emerge from this global catastrophe. We are not trying to recreate the old world, we are trying to build something that can survive and thrive in the new one. The knowledge preservation efforts have become a major focus of our community organization. We are documenting survival techniques, recording technical knowledge, maintaining educational materials, and teaching practical skills to ensure that critical information will not be lost. This includes everything from basic medical procedures to advanced agricultural techniques, to the organizational systems that have allowed our community to function effectively. The documentation project includes written records, but also hands-on training programs that ensure skills are actually transferred rather than just recorded. We are training multiple people in each critical skill area to provide redundancy in case key individuals are lost. We are also developing simplified versions of complex technical procedures that can be performed with the limited resources available in our post-collapse environment. Our community has become a model that other survivor groups are attempting to replicate. We regularly receive visits from representatives of other communities who want to learn about our organizational systems, resource management techniques, and survival strategies. This consulting role has given us additional resources through trade relationships and has helped us build a network of allied communities across the region. The consulting relationships have evolved into a form of franchise system where successful organizational models are adapted to different community circumstances. We provide training and ongoing support to help other communities establish similar systems, while they provide us with resources and information about conditions in their areas. This network approach is allowing successful survival strategies to spread much more rapidly than would happen through isolated community development. The trade relationships have evolved into a primitive but functional economic system. Different communities specialize in different products or services, and we exchange these through organized trade networks. Our community trades medical services and emergency coordination expertise for food, fuel, manufactured goods, and raw materials that we cannot produce ourselves. The economic development is creating opportunities for individual entrepreneurship within the community context. People are developing specialized skills that have trade value with other communities, creating personal economic opportunities while contributing to community welfare. This individual economic development is providing additional motivation for skill development and innovation. The regional coordination network has grown to include more than 20 communities across several states. We maintain regular radio contact, coordinate responses to security threats, share information about resource availability, and organize joint projects that benefit multiple communities. This network represents the beginning of larger-scale social organization that might eventually evolve into more formal governmental structures. The network coordination requires sophisticated communication and organizational systems that are challenging to maintain with our limited resources. We have established communication schedules, standardized reporting procedures, and coordination protocols that allow effective management of multi-community projects. These systems are becoming the foundation for larger-scale governance structures that might emerge as our communities continue to develop. The social and cultural development of our community has been as important as the practical survival achievements. We have established traditions, celebrations, and cultural practices that help maintain group identity and morale. These include regular community meetings, shared meals, educational activities, and seasonal observances that mark the passage of time and provide structure to our lives. The cultural development includes artistic and creative activities that might seem like luxury in a survival situation, but are actually critical for psychological health and community cohesion. We have organized music performances, storytelling sessions, and craft activities that provide entertainment and creative expression. These activities help maintain the human elements of life that make survival worthwhile. My name is Donovan Castellanos, and I survived the first 11 days of the Ice Age apocalypse by learning that sometimes survival means accepting that the world has fundamentally changed and adapting to it rather than fighting it. If you are listening to this message, then you have survived too, and you understand that we are all building the new world together, one day at a time. The old world ended in 11 days. The new world is whatever we make it. This recording is being broadcast on emergency frequencies in hopes of reaching other survivor communities. If you are out there, if you are listening, know that organized communities are forming, that people are cooperating and rebuilding, and that survival is possible if we work together. The first 11 days were about staying alive. Everything that comes after is about building a future. And despite everything we have lost, despite everything that has changed, we are still here. We are still human. And we are still building tomorrow.